There's a kind of silence that belongs only to a house that has held too much. Not the peaceful kind, the other kind. The kind that collects in corners and refuses to leave. The kind you feel in your chest before you even cross the threshold. Every family knows it. Most families just never have to walk away from it in front of the whole world watching. William and Kate knew that silence well. They had lived inside it for 3 years. It started the moment they arrived at Adelaide Cottage in August 2022, a modest little home by royal standards, tucked quietly inside Windsor Castle grounds, chosen deliberately for what it was not rather than what it was. No grand rooms, no live-in staff, no performance of grandeur, just a pink-walled cottage small enough that the children would bump into each other in the hallways, small enough that a family could actually feel like a family. That was the whole point. William and Kate had watched royalty swallow people whole, and they were determined it would not swallow their children. So they chose small. They chose simple. They chose real. And for a few bright days at the end of that August, it worked. George starting at his new school. Charlotte skipping through the garden. Little Louis discovering the world existed beyond Kensington Palace. The air felt like possibility. Kate had hung curtains herself. There were family dinners and school-run mornings and the ordinary, precious chaos of 3 children under one roof. For a short and shining moment, it felt like they had outrun everything. Then Queen Elizabeth II died. She passed on September 8th, 2022, just days after they had settled in. The cottage had barely finished holding the smell of fresh paint before it became the place where the world changed, where the weight of what was coming landed on William's shoulders all at once. He was no longer just a father running school runs. He was the Prince of Wales. And Kate, who had only just arranged the children's rooms the way she wanted them, was now Princess of Wales. The titles they had always known were coming arrived like a door kicked open. No warning, no transition, just a wait, and then more weight on top of it. In the months that followed, while the public watched the formal ceremonies and the perfectly pressed morning clothes and the steady royal faces, Adelaide Cottage sat in Windsor, holding private things. The press of a family finding its footing inside a grief that was both personal and constitutional. The children asking questions that had no clean answers. William carrying a loss for a grandmother that was also, in its complicated way, the loss of a particular version of his life. The one where becoming king still felt distant enough to be theoretical. It did not stay theoretical long. Then came what William himself would later call the bruising. The books, the documentaries, the very public unraveling of the relationship between the Wales household and Harry and Meghan played out across Netflix screens and bestseller lists and every front page in the world. What should have been private family grief became public theater. Adelaide Cottage held that too. Kate, who has always been composed in a way that looks effortless and costs everything, carried the particular weight of being written about by people who had sat at her table. William, who learned reserve from the inside of a very painful childhood, went quieter in the way that men do when the hurt runs too deep for words. But none of that was what finally broke the spell of Adelaide Cottage. None of that was what made it impossible to stay. In early 2024, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was diagnosed with cancer. Nobody in the world knew yet. The public would not know for weeks. But inside that pink cottage in Windsor, a conversation happened that no announcement could ever fully capture. A husband sat with a wife, and the word came into the room, and it changed the air permanently. 3 children slept upstairs with no idea, and William and Kate did what they had always done in the face of impossible things. They faced it together. They held it together, and they did not let it touch the children more than they absolutely could help. She began chemotherapy, quietly, in private. The cottage that had once felt like a sanctuary became the place where Kate sat through the long, exhausting hours that treatment demands, where she fought something the public could only glimpse from the outside. William managed royal duties while managing a household in crisis, which is not a thing that has a handbook. You simply do what needs doing, and you fold the fear into a smaller and smaller shape, and you keep going because the children need breakfast, and the world needs its future king to keep standing upright. Kate would later say, when she finally spoke about it publicly in July 2025, that the period after treatment ended was in some ways harder than the treatment itself. That people expect recovery to be simple. That you expect it to be simple. That there's a moment when the chemotherapy stops and you think, right, now I can go back to normal. And then you discover that normal no longer exists in the form you left it. That you have to find it again, piece by piece, in a body and a life that's been fundamentally rearranged. It's a roller coaster, she said. Not smooth, like you expect it to be. Adelaide Cottage heard all of that. It held all of that. And with every passing month, it stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a record of suffering. Not because it was a bad place, but because it remembered too much. Because the walls knew things that a fresh start cannot carry with it. Royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith would put it plainly later that year. Adelaide Cottage had become a place of pain, suffering, and sadness. You cannot argue with a description that accurate. By January 2025, Kate stood before the world and said the word that the world had been holding its breath waiting for. Remission. She was in remission. It is a relief, she wrote, in the careful language of someone who has learned not to reach too far ahead. And I remain focused on recovery. Those two words, focused on recovery, carried the whole truth of what Adelaide Cottage had been for the past year. A place of necessary endurance, not a place of renewal. Something in both of them understood, even then, that renewal would have to happen somewhere else. The months that followed were slow and deliberate returning. Kate came back to public duties gradually, the way the sun comes back after a long gray winter, tentatively at first, testing the warmth, then with more confidence, then fully. She attended Wimbledon in June 2025 with William and the children. She stood at the trooping of the color, and the public saw her face, and the collective exhale of an entire nation was almost audible. She was there. She was standing. She was smiling in the real way, not the performance way. And William stood beside her with the expression of a man who has watched someone he loves fight very hard for something and is watching them win. Through all of it, Adelaide Cottage waited. The curtains Kate had hung. The garden the children had played in. The small rooms that had held large things. It waited to be left, because by then, both of them had known for some time, that leaving was not a defeat. It was the next right thing. It was what you do when a chapter is finished. When you have survived what a place asked you to survive, and it is time to stop asking it to be more than it can be. They had found somewhere new, somewhere that did not know any of this yet, somewhere that had no memory of the hard years, because it had not been theirs yet, a home that could only hold what they chose to bring to it. And what they intended to bring was different. They intended to bring the version of themselves that had come through. The ones that the cottage, for all its hard years, had made stronger. The goodbye was coming, and it was going to be everything. There's a particular kind of decision that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with fanfare or press releases or the formal language of official announcements. It arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary morning, and it feels less like a choice and more like a recognition. A recognition that something is over and something else, something better, is ready to begin. That was how the decision about Forest Lodge came. It had been discussed naturally. William and Kate are not people who do things impulsively. They carry the weight of institution on their backs every single day, and it teaches you a particular kind of deliberateness. But beyond the logistics and the timing and the practical business of moving a family of 5, there was something quieter underneath all of it. A feeling that had been building since January, since Kate had said the word remission and the air in Adelaide Cottage had shifted. Not lightened, exactly. More like clarified, like a window being cleaned from the inside. Suddenly, you could see through it again. And what they saw through it was the possibility of somewhere different. Somewhere that had not watched Kate fight for her life. Somewhere that did not hold the particular quality of silence that belongs to a house that has witnessed chemotherapy. Forest Lodge sat in Windsor Great Park like a quiet answer to a question they had been carrying for months. 8 bedrooms, Georgian in its bones, built in 1831, with stone facades and a vaulted entrance hall, and the kind of architecture that suggests permanence without demanding grandeur. It sat on 4,800 acres of trails and meadows and Old English woodland. Kate, who had spoken publicly about nature being her sanctuary, her actual word, sanctuary, could walk out of the back door into something vast and green and uncomplicated. The children could disappear into the kind of outdoor space that makes childhood feel like childhood is supposed to feel. William, who had inherited from his mother a deep need for places that exist outside the machinery of royal life, could breathe there. Actually breathe. The way you can only breathe somewhere that does not require anything from you in exchange. A royal source told the BBC that summer, Windsor has become their home. However, over the last few years while they have lived at Adelaide Cottage, there have been some really difficult times. Moving gives them an opportunity for a fresh start and a new chapter. An opportunity to leave some of the more unhappy memories behind. Read those words carefully. Not an upgrade, not an expansion, a leaving behind. The move was going to be funded privately. William and Kate paying market rent out of their own pocket. No sovereign grant, no public money, no headline about taxpayer expenditure. That was important to them. In a time of sharper public scrutiny of royal spending than perhaps any previous era, they had chosen to make this a private thing in the most literal sense. Their money, their home, their decision. It was the same instinct that had led them to Adelaide Cottage in the first place. The instinct towards something real and self-determined, something that did not require justification to anyone. And there would be no live-in staff, just as there had been none at Adelaide Cottage. The children would continue growing up in a house where parents were present, where ordinary life had room to exist, where the morning routine belonged to the family and not to an institution. They set themselves a goal. Bonfire night, November 5th, 2025. That was when they wanted to be in. It had the feeling of a dare they were making to themselves, a way of making the move real by giving it a date that meant something. Half-term for the children. A natural pause in the school rhythm. A window that belonged to the family rather than to the royal calendar. They made it. In the first days of November 2025, quietly and without ceremony, William and Kate loaded up the life they had built inside Adelaide Cottage and carried it into Forest Lodge. The children's things, Kate's mood boards. She had apparently been collecting reference images for the redecoration for months, excited in a way that felt distinctly and purely like herself, like the woman who hangs her own curtains and cares about how a room feels. Her excitement about those mood boards was one of the details that slipped out through the press later in the year, and it landed in the public imagination with an unexpected tenderness. The Princess of Wales had fought cancer inside one house and was now choosing the colors for the next one. That is a sentence that deserves to sit alone for a moment. But as the new rooms were being learned, the sound of the hallways, the way morning light came through the east-facing windows, the particular geography of a new kitchen, there was something else happening simultaneously. Something the public watched without always having the language for. The world was watching William and Kate return. Not return in the sense of resuming their prior schedule. Return in a deeper sense. The sense of two people who have been through something enormous and have come out on the other side of it still standing, still together, still holding hands at public appearances in the uncalculated way that couples do when they are genuinely in each other's corner. There's a performance of togetherness that royals sometimes deliver, which is polished and correct and completely hollow. And then there's what William and Kate showed the public in the latter half of 2025, which was something altogether different. Something that the public, who had watched this couple for 15 years by then, could actually feel. When Kate appeared at the Duchess of Kent's funeral in September 2025, the cameras caught a moment between her and King Charles that stopped people mid-scroll. She gave him a kiss on the cheek as he was leaving. Her hand stayed on his shoulder a beat longer than necessary. She curtsied. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been through something alongside someone and has not forgotten it. The moment lasted 4 seconds. It felt like everything that the past 2 years had quietly contained distilled into a gesture. The press called it sweet. The people who understood what the past year had cost both of them called it something more than that. William, for his part, had been doing the kind of quiet, public grieving that men who were raised to hold themselves together do in the only way available to them, through action. His Earthshot prize, his trip to Brazil in late 2025, standing in front of Christ the Redeemer in a photo that echoed his mother in ways the whole world noticed immediately and said nothing about because some things are too tender to pick apart. He had told a Brazilian broadcaster that summer that the hardest year of his life had taught him that families grow stronger when they confront difficulty together, when they choose communication over silence, when they refuse to let the weight make them distant from the people they love. He was 43 years old. He had buried his grandmother, watched his father diagnosed with cancer, watched his wife fight cancer, navigated a family rupture that played out on global television, and moved his 3 children through all of it while trying to protect their ordinary childhood. He had done it. They had done it. And now, in November 2025, they were standing in the entrance hall of a house that did not know any of that yet, with 8 bedrooms and 4,800 acres and the possibility of a future that had not yet been assigned any of its weight. The world watched Forest Lodge in the way the world watches things that feel privately significant even across a great distance. The photographs that emerged, not official, not staged, but caught by long lenses in public moments, showed something in Kate's face that had not been visible in quite that form for some time. A loosening. Not happiness exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something more specific. The particular quality of relief that belongs only to someone who has survived something they were not certain they would survive and is now on the far side of it, standing in the light. William stood next to her at every public appearance during that period the way he has always stood next to her, close enough that their arms almost touched, turned slightly toward her, as if his whole orientation in space has one fixed point. That had not changed. Through everything, that had not changed. But something else had changed, something harder to name and more important than the new address. The 2 people standing in those photographs, at the hospital visit in January 2026, at the investiture ceremony where they share their different camera angle with their 17 million social media followers, and the comments filled with tears in my eyes at the New Year post that said simply, "Thank you for a brilliant 2025. We're not the same 2 people who had moved into Adelaide Cottage in August 2022. They were the same people in all the ways that matter. But they had been somewhere, and coming back from somewhere changes you in ways that polish and protocol cannot. The world had watched them go through it, and now the world was watching them come back. And the watching was different now. It had the quality of something earned. Adelaide Cottage sat empty in Windsor's home park. The curtains Kate had hung, the garden, the small rooms, the silence that had been so many things over 3 years. And Forest Lodge waited, full of rooms that had not yet been asked to hold anything. The world has a long habit of watching the royal family and seeing what it needs to see. In times of national grief, it sees stability. In times of celebration, it sees pageantry. In times of scandal, it sees drama. But there are rare moments, genuinely rare, the kind that come perhaps once or twice in a generation, when the watching shifts, when the distance collapses, when something passes through the glass between the institution and the public and becomes simply, unmistakably human. The closing of Adelaide Cottage was one of those moments. Nobody declared it to be so. There was no official statement that said, "Here is an emotional milestone. Please feel something." The royal family does not work that way, and William and Kate, more than perhaps anyone in the institution's modern history, have built their public identity precisely around refusing to be performed at. What happened instead was quieter and, for that reason, more powerful. A series of small, accumulating moments that the public collected and held and carried around with them, the way you carry something you don't have a frame for yet, but know you will one day. There was the January 2026 visit to Charing Cross Hospital, their first joint public appearance of the new year, in the first days after the Christmas holiday they had spent together at Sandringham. Kate stood among NHS nurses and volunteers with a quality of attention that she has always had, but that seemed different now. More direct. The way attention becomes when you have been on the receiving end of exactly that kind of care, when you have spent months in the particular vulnerability of a patient and, from the inside, what it costs the people giving the care. She told the staff, "There's some amazing work going on here. It makes a big difference to patients' lives." Simple words, but she meant them in a way that the staff in that room could feel was not scripted courtesy. It was recognition from someone who had been a patient, from someone who knew. William stood nearby with the slightly loosened ease of a man in a good stretch of life. He asked the crowd if they'd had a good new year, if 2026 was going to be good to them, with the open warmth that he carries in those unscripted in-between moments when the official machinery quiets for a second and the actual person shows through. He smiled in the way that reaches his eyes. The crowd responded the way crowds respond to William and Kate when they are like this. Not with the formal, overawed reception of people before royalty, but with something warmer, something more like recognition, like running into someone you've been quietly rooting for. Because that is what had happened without any press strategy or communications campaign or carefully managed narrative arc. The public had been quietly rooting for them, through all of it, through the cancer diagnosis and the chemotherapy and the absence from public life and the carefully worded statements and the first tentative return to public appearances, and the Wimbledon photographs, and the remission announcement, and the move to Forest Lodge. Through all the things that happened inside the private rooms of a life the public could only partially see, they had been quietly rooting for them to be okay. And they were okay. That was the thing. They were better than okay. Kate had emerged from something that unmakes people, and she had not been unmade. She had been, in a language that royal historian Amanda Foreman reached for, someone who had stared down the abyss. She was now decorating a new house with mood boards she had been collecting for months. She was bringing her 3 children through a winter in a new home in Windsor Great Park where they could run through thousands of acres of English countryside. She was standing at hospital visits with the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who have genuinely been changed by what they have seen. She was a woman who had been all the way to the edge and had walked back from it with her children and her husband and herself intact. The public watched the New Year post from the Prince and Princess of Wales on January 1st, 2026. A series of photographs from across the year. The children at Trooping of the Color, Kate's spring video from May, William in Brazil in front of Christ the Redeemer, Kate and little Louis at the Together at Christmas Carol concert, smiling at each other in the particular way that a mother and her youngest child smile, like they share a private joke the world will never be let in on. The caption said simply, "Happy New Year to everyone around the world. Thank you for a brilliant 2025 and looking forward to 2026. It received over 300,000 likes, 3 times as many as the King and Queen's post, because people were not just responding to a royal update. They were responding to a story they had been living alongside for 2 years. A story that had a particular and very necessary kind of ending. Not a resolution, because life does not resolve, but an emergence. An emergence into something that looked unmistakably like the future. But the moment that captivated people most was not a viral post or a polished photograph. It was something smaller than that. Something caught rather than arranged. It was the moment at the Duchess of Kent's funeral in September 2025, the 4-second exchange between Kate and King Charles as he was leaving. Her hand on his shoulder, the kiss on the cheek, the curtsy, the way he looked at her. It was a moment between 2 people who had each, in their own way, been through something that had changed them, who had sat with the word cancer in separate rooms and carried it with them through separate days and found, when they were standing together in front of the cameras and the history books, that the shared experience had made something between them that had not existed in quite that form before. It was private. It happened in public. And the people who watched it understood, without being told, that what they were seeing was real. The royal family is an institution that has survived for centuries by being precisely that, an institution, by being legible and stable and arranged, by presenting versions of itself that the public can use as symbols of continuity and permanence. William and Kate have always carried that function. They have done so since the balcony at Buckingham Palace on the day they married, when 1 billion people watched them and projected onto them all the hope that young love can hold. They have done it at christenings and state visits and trooping of the colors and Christmas services through 14 years of public life, through the long project of becoming the future. But what the past 3 years produced was something additional, something the institution cannot manufacture and could not have planned for. It produced authenticity, not the managed press release version, the actual thing, the kind that comes from living through something real and having the public watch you do it and seeing in the watching that you're not a symbol but a person, that the woman who spent months quietly fighting cancer in a pink cottage in Windsor is also a mother who cares about her mood boards, that the man who described the previous year as the hardest of his life is also the man who asks a hospital crowd if 2026 is going to be a good year, with the open face of someone who genuinely wants to know. Adelaide Cottage is empty now. Whatever comes next for that little house, whatever family walks through its door, whatever new life decides to arrange itself inside its modest rooms, it will not know what the walls know. What a hell for those 3 years cannot be transferred. The grief of September 2022. The silent weeks when the world did not know yet that Kate was ill. The long chemotherapy hours. The slow return. The moment when two people looked at each other and understood that it was time to go. All of that belongs to the cottage now. It is part of its history in the way that only private things become history, quietly, without ceremony, and permanently. What William and Kate took with them to Forest Lodge was the part that remains after you have survived something. The version of yourselves that could not have existed without everything that was endured to produce it. Harder in the way that certain materials become harder under pressure. More certain of what matters. More clear about what they are protecting and why. George, 12 years old, growing into someone who will one day be king. Charlotte, 10, with the particular fierce intelligence that has been her signature since she was old enough to look directly into cameras without blinking. Louis, 7, who belongs to a different chapter of childhood, one that has known nothing but the ordinary, extraordinary life his parents have worked so hard to give him. They would wake up in Forest Lodge in the mornings and not know what the other house remembered. They would run into the park. They would come home for dinner. They would grow up in rooms that their mother had decorated with mood boards, and their father's fingerprints were all over because that is who these two people are. People who do the work themselves. The world watched the goodbye to Adelaide Cottage and felt something that it did not immediately have words for. It took a little time, as these things do, to understand what was moving about it, why it mattered, why millions of people who have no particular stake in where a royal family lives found themselves genuinely affected by the news of a move. It was because it was not about the house. It was never about the house. It was about what the house represented, the before and the after. The version of William and Kate who arrived in August 2022, hoping for something simple and private and real, and the version of them who left in November 2025, having lived through more than they bargained for, having fought for the people they love, having held each other and their children through the kind of years that either break a family or make it into something unbreakable. They left, together, all 5 of them, into something that had not yet been asked to hold anything. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.